In this video, I'm going to share how I mapped the argument from Chapter 1, Section 1, What is Food? So first, let's take a look at the outline of this section of the chapter from the book. Here are the headings, the subtitles for each section, and this is a good reminder for what topic was discussed: natural kinds, functional kinds, that point about pets, socially constructed kinds, something about normativity, something about subjectivity. As you're reading, be on the lookout for relationships between these sections, especially in terms of spelling out an argument. Oftentimes in a philosophy text, you're going to go down a few rabbit holes, and being able to keep the bigger picture in your head, which is the structure of an overarching argument, will help you to not only remember what you've read, but to understand how the argument works, and when it comes time to evaluate it, be able to do that strategically as well. So, as I read, I was on the lookout for what is the author doing in each section and why. And here's what I came up with. First, they introduce a question, what's food, a received view, the nutritional definition or a common sense view, a problem. The common sense conception, the one we find in the dictionary, is ambiguous, and a main claim. There are two ways to interpret the dictionary definition so that it's not ambiguous, and neither way works. An alternative is better. The next section, two sections, consider and evaluate two different interpretations of the nutritional definition, our common sense starting point, the dictionary definition starting point. And the next section wraps up and argues why neither one works. Even if we clarify the ambiguity, neither possible interpretation works. She then introduces an alternative, that food is a socially constructed kind or category, and gives some reasons why that makes sense, and considers and responds to objections. So that's the argumentative structure. So then I went back and I added subtitles to the book outline that are more informative about what the point of each section is and how it all fits together into a whole. And this was a crucial step in my mapping the argument so I don't get lost in the weeds but can see the bigger picture. So here's my first subtitle. What is food? Introduction. Question. What is food? Problem. Nutritional definition is ambiguous. Main claim. Food is socially constructed. Section 1.1. Food is natural kind. One way of interpreting the nutritional definition that doesn't work. Section 1.2. Food is functional kind. Another way of interpreting the nutritional definition that doesn't work. 1.3. Food is nutrition. Why not eat pets? Subtitle. The problem with the nutritional definition is that equating food with nutrition is too simple. 1.4. Socially constructed kinds. Subtitle. An alternative that is better. 1.5. Social construction and normativity. Subtitle. Here's an objection and some responses. 1.6. Social construction and subjectivity. Here are some additional interesting things in a transition to the next section. Okay, now that I have this, I mapped the argument. I will share a link with you to the interactive version of the argument. I'm going to be expanding and collapsing nodes, and I do that just by double-clicking. So the main claim of this text, which comes at the end but in our map is going to be at the top of the map because we're building support, kind of like a building here. The nutritional definition of food is inadequate. An adequate definition of food must capture its socially constructed meaning. So there's two parts to this main claim, and I broke them up into co-premises here. One, the nutritional definition is inadequate, even when we clear up the ambiguity. And two, an adequate definition must capture its socially constructed meaning. Okay, so I also added little labels that connect to the subtitles from the text, so you can kind of see where we are in the text as it got mapped in the argument. So in the introduction, the main strategy is that there are two ways of interpreting the nutritional definition, since it's ambiguous, as a natural kind and a functional kind, and neither interpretation provides an adequate definition of food. First we look at one, then we look at the other. Let's pause on that for a moment. and open up this one. So recall, the nutritional definition of food is that food is something that gives us nutrition. That's it. This is a common sense way of thinking about food, and if you look in the dictionary, that's what we find. Here's what Plakias says. Here's a quote. Upon examination, the nutritional definition is ambiguous between two readings. On one, food's physical properties, containing nutrients, make it the kind of thing it is. On the other, it's the role that food plays, as something we consume for sustenance, that defines it. This disambiguation parallels two philosophical approaches to classification: the idea that categories like food pick out natural kinds, and the idea that they pick out functional kinds. So we've noted there are two ways of making sense of our starting point, our dictionary definition. And we look at each one. Now, ultimately, her conclusion is neither one is good. Now, in a map, if something's under a green bar, it means it's a reason to believe the thing above. So if these two things are true, then we should believe the nutritional definition is inadequate. If something is in a red bar, it means this undermines this claim. It's a reason to reject it. So I also color-coded in red anything that Plakias only considered hypothetically as the kind of thing one might claim or argue, which she ultimately rejected and didn't accept. Okay, so one might say, and this comes from food as a natural kind, that it makes sense to define food in terms of its physical properties. Food is the collection of substances that are capable of providing nourishment. And on this characterization, food is a natural kind. Anything with a certain set of underlying properties is fit to be grouped together as food. Now note, definition of natural kind, group of things fit to be grouped together because they share some essential underlying properties, independently of the beliefs or needs or practices of humans doing the grouping or categorizing. Examples: water, gold, species, planet, maybe. Clarification: to say that something's a natural kind is to say that the grouping or the category is natural, even if certain members of the category are man-made. For example, what makes something gold, a naturally occurring element, is that it has 79 protons in its nucleus. What makes something californium, a synthetic man-made element, is that it has 98 protons in its nucleus. Both of them seem fit to be grouped together in terms of number of protons in their nucleus, whether it's man-made or naturally occurring. Okay, so we'll ignore that and move on to the reasons. So why think it makes sense to define food in terms of its physical properties? Well, foods do have properties in common. Which properties? Water, fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. Just like elements have something in common, number of protons in their nucleus, or perhaps different substances have their molecular structure in common. Water is made up of H2O, has a certain molecular structure. Foods have water, fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, and it's in virtue of these properties that they provide nutrition. So they do have things in common, and these properties allow us to draw a plausible, seemingly natural boundary around food. They're the building blocks of nutrition. So if you accept these two things, then it makes sense to treat food as a natural category, to define food in terms of physical properties. Objections. Well, there's not like a single underlying property or set of properties that all foods share, as in the case of gold or water. But possible response, there doesn't need to be a single set of properties. Just as there's more than one way to be jade, you can be jadeite or nephrite, there's more than one way to count as food. To be food is to be composed of carbohydrate or fat or protein and so on. But objection to that, the longer the list, the less appropriate natural kind seems to be. And in the case of food, the list of properties in virtue of which foods nourish seems kind of long. It's not a neat and tidy organizational scheme. But we're kind of, where do we leave off here? We do have an objection to this way. This is something that's not great about the definition, but maybe if there isn't a better one, isn't that big of a problem. The more important issue is the other premise, that these properties allow us to draw a very plausible, natural boundary around food. We'll get an objection to this in the next section. So let's look at that. Food as a functional kind. So if we set this side aside, we might argue that it makes sense to define food in terms of its role or function. So the definition of food is that which performs the function of nourishing us. Yes, it's in virtue of certain properties, but any combination of properties is fine. It's the function that ties things together as belonging in the food category. So definition, functional kind. A group of things fit to be grouped together because they share an essential role or function, independently of the beliefs or needs or practices of humans doing the grouping or categorizing. Examples, chair, camshaft, heart. We discussed these in class. Okay, so reason for thinking that makes sense. Well, unlike the messy groups of properties that foods might have in common, foods do have a single common function, even if they perform that function in virtue of a wide variety of properties. That function allows us to draw a very plausible, seemingly natural boundary around food. The function, of course, performs the function of nourishing us. Okay, so here we get the objection to whether we're looking at properties or function. We do seem to be able to draw a plausible, seemingly natural boundary around food. Is that right? And in section 1.3, we get into the objection to both of these ways of thinking about the nature of food as a category. And the claim here is that equating food with nutrition is too simple. We eat and we avoid eating too many things for too many reasons, for these definitions to adequately capture the complexity of food. And to support this claim that it's too simple, which might seem just plausible, but it's really important to spell out our reasoning, she lays out two lines of argument. One, there's the objection, or the support for this objection. It's too simple in that the definition seems too narrow. It seems to leave out things that count as food. And it also seems too broad. It seems to count things as food that it's weird to count as food. So let's look at the too narrow side. Okay, so there are many things we eat for purposes other than nutrition. Support. So if we define food as what we actually use for nutritional purposes, we run into trouble because a lot of what we eat is not consumed for its nutrition. We eat for entertainment, we eat for emotion, we eat for rituals, both religious and secular. So maybe we shouldn't define it in terms of what we eat it for. Maybe instead we define food as whatever does give us nutrition, whatever our reason for eating it is. But the problem here is that there are things we eat that aren't nutritious. So even if we change that definition, we run into trouble because we eat things with no nutritional value, including sugar-free desserts, soda, etc. And if you think those should count as food, then the definition's too narrow. The other bit of support for thinking it's too simple to equate food with nutrition is that there are nutritious things we don't eat. So we don't eat other humans and certain animals. Those would be a good source of nutrition, but they are not food. So there seems to be something more than having the capacity to supply us with nutrition when we are looking for an adequate definition of food. So let's close this up. We have now argued, we've laid out two possible ways of thinking about food and argued against them to reach the conclusion that neither of these interpretations of the nutritional definition is adequate. And unless there is some other way to spell it out, we can conclude that the nutritional definition itself is inadequate. So what's the alternative? The claim is that an adequate definition must capture its socially constructed meaning. And here's where we get to section 1.4, socially constructed kinds. The claim is that food is a socially constructed category. Here's a quote from the text that captures what we're talking about here. Food is socially constructed. Rather than a category we discover in nature, it's a category we build and sustain through our beliefs and behaviors. when we talk about food, we're not just describing the biological properties of the thing in question. To label something food is to assign it a place in our social practices. Food is treated a certain way, ingested at certain times and in certain contexts, and has a certain meaning. All of that's a bit vague. It would be nice to spell it out, but these are the kinds of things that are true of a socially constructed category. It has to incorporate all these nuances and not just what are the physical properties it has. Fats, proteins, water, etc. Okay. So why think that? Here, this is what it means to say that, but why think that? What are the reasons? One line of reasoning is that the fact that food is socially constructed, if that's a fact, explains many of our practices. So if we think of food, if we understand food as a socially constructed category, that explains why other humans and certain animals aren't food. It explains cultural differences between what's recognized as food and what's not. It explains why medicine is not food. It explains the connections between food and social practices, or at least we can go a bit further and actually spell these things out when we are conceiving of food as socially constructed. So it succeeds where the objection to the other possibility failed, and there's a further section where we consider objections to this claim. So that's the social construction and normativity section. So the main idea, which has two claims here, is that any definition of food that treats it as socially constructed is too narrow and value-laden. So let's unpack that. So let's look at too narrow claim number 1. To say that food is what we eat, maybe in certain ways, around a table, or for certain reasons, entertainment, emotion, ritual, is to suggest that food is consumed intentionally and attentively. But food is not always consumed intentionally and attentively. People eat in cars, people eat for purely nutritional purposes, like eating powdered foods instead of cooking. How does Plakias respond to this point? Well, she accepts that. So this is probably too strong. We don't need to say that food is always eaten intentionally and attentively for deep, interesting social or emotional reasons. We just need an account of food that makes sense of these facts about our food practices. So we can agree with all of this without thinking that food has to be eaten in this particular way. The next claim that it's too narrow is that by defining food in terms of beliefs, attitudes, social practices, etc., the social construction account makes food a distinctively human creation. But non-human animals eat food, and non-human animals don't have food-related beliefs, attitudes, social practices, etc., in virtue of which some things are food and some aren't. One potential objection is to get into the non-human animal case, which is interesting. Maybe some animals do to some extent, blah, blah, blah. We're not going to go that route. Instead, let's focus on the even if no other animals have the kinds of social practices that we do, this still doesn't undermine our conception of food. Why? We can have more than one account of food, one meaning of the word food. So perhaps a social constructivist account fits the human conception of food, but a functionalist account fits an animal's relationship with food. Perhaps animals eat for nutrition and humans eat for socially meaningful reasons. And to make it clear, or to sort of, this might be support or it might just be illustration, we've got an analogy. So just as we can have more than one account of family, and an account of family that has to do with certain social, emotional relationships may apply to humans but not animals, whereas a more basic account of family may apply to both. So if we're just talking like genealogical relationships, humans and animals both have families. If we mean something slightly more than that, maybe they still both have families, but there are certainly ways that humans can form and conceive of families that apply to humans and not animals in virtue of our distinctive capacities for certain emotions and relationships and roles. Okay, so we've done away with this objection, or at least responded to it in a meaningful way. Finally, there's the claim that it could be value-laden, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but the claim is it could be problematically value-laden. So analyzing food as socially constructed turns it into a normative kind, a classification that incorporates ideas not just about what and how people do eat, but how they ought to eat. And this is problematic if we think the definition of food should apply to people eating protein bars in their car, as well as people gathered around a table for a holiday enjoying a meal together. But the response here is, this isn't necessarily true. Analyzing food as socially constructed doesn't need to turn it into a normative kind about it doesn't need to classify food in terms of how we ought to eat. You're really eating food if you're eating at a table with your family, and you're not really eating food when you eat a protein bar in your car. We don't need to say that kind of thing. So instead of objecting to this claim, she says, well, not necessarily. We can accept this as a caution that we should be careful not to do this or to not do it in ways that are overly narrow, because we don't want to be overly narrow when it comes to thinking about how one ought to eat. Throughout the course, we are going to consider claims about how we ought to eat, but maybe they will or won't have implications for what is and is not food, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. So that is the structure of the argument, and the reason for going into this in such detail is to compare the structure we get from just the text to the structure that we can pull out when we are considering what the author is doing in developing an argument, and then how that gets visualized. And so notice that the map isn't organized in exactly the same way as the text. So we've got the introduction section, then section 4. So you kind of go off on a branch, and that will lead you to other things worth grouping together as sections, and then the objection to one is sort of its own section. So they're not all hierarchically on the same level, each section. They relate to each other as reasons and objections to claims that come together to build an argument for a main claim.